Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I had been on the road for hours that night, my eyes heavy from the monotony of passing headlights and the constant stretch of dark highway that seemed to never end. My GPS had stopped working an hour earlier, leaving me with no sense of exactly where I was. I knew I had veered off the main interstate when I followed a smaller road in search of gas, or maybe a place to grab a cup of coffee. My tank wasn't empty, but it was low enough to make me nervous, and the creeping silence of the backroads wasn't doing my nerves any favors. Every now and then, the beams of my headlights would catch the edge of a farmhouse or a rusted mailbox leaning toward the ditch, but for the most part it was just me, my car, and the unbroken darkness. When I finally saw a splash of color cutting through the night, it felt like a relief. Neon lights glowed ahead, glowing pink and blue, buzzing faintly even from a distance. As I rolled closer, I could make out the shape of a diner. It looked like something out of the past, the kind of place that had probably served truckers and travelers for decades. A chrome exterior caught the glow of the lights, and a faded sign above the entrance flickered, as if the tubes of neon were struggling to stay alive. What really caught me off guard, though, were the cars. Several of them sat lined up neatly in the gravel lot in front of the building. Old sedans, a pickup truck or two, one with a tarp stretched sloppily across the bed. They weren't abandoned. They looked like they belonged to people who had parked just to come inside for a late-night meal. The lights inside the diner were warm, spilling through the big front windows, and I could see shadows moving around in the booths. A couple of figures sat hunched over tables, a waitress-shaped outline moved between them, and for the first time in hours I felt a spark of relief. Finally, somewhere to stop. Somewhere real. I pulled my car into the lot and killed the engine. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, and I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, letting the sudden quiet sink in. For a second, I thought I could hear the faint hum of the neon sign buzzing overhead, but maybe that was just in my head. I got out and stretched, the cool air cutting across my arms, and I walked up to the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The chrome door handle felt colder than I expected. I pulled on it gently, expecting it to swing open to the warm smell of coffee and greasy food, but it didn't budge. I tried again, tugging harder this time. Locked. I stood there staring at the door for a few seconds, confused. Everything about the place screamed open. Cars outside, lights glowing, shapes of people moving inside, like it was just another normal night at a roadside diner. I leaned forward, pressing my hand against the glass. The inside looked perfectly alive. A man sat in a booth, his shoulders hunched as if he were eating. Across the room, two others seemed locked in a quiet conversation. Another booth had someone who looked like they were turned slightly toward the window. Their features were blurred by the glare of the neon reflecting off the glass, but I could clearly see heads, arms moving, gestures. Still thinking maybe I was missing something, I knocked lightly on the glass with my knuckles. Every single head inside turned toward me at the same exact moment. The sound of my knock seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. They didn't move at first, just stared. No one waved me off or motioned for me to wait. They didn't smile. They didn't frown. They didn't do anything at all. It was just dozens of eyes locked onto me, every figure in the diner frozen in place. The waitress who had been mid-step when I first noticed her stood there, tray balanced against her hip, her face angled straight at me now. My throat went dry. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt a creeping chill run down my spine. Something about the silence, the way they all looked at me without expression, made the air feel heavy wrong. I forced a weak smile and gave a little wave, half hoping someone would break the stillness and come unlock the door. Nothing. Not a single twitch or sign of life. Just eyes. It felt like an eternity. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every second stretching out longer and longer. I slowly stepped back from the glass, the gravel crunching under my shoes loud in the silence. Without taking my eyes off the window, I moved toward my car, half expecting one of them to suddenly get up and follow me. They didn't move. They didn't break their stare. By the time I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands were trembling. I fumbled with the keys, jammed them into the ignition, and started the car. The headlights cut across the front of the diner, catching the glossy reflection of the neon in the glass, washing over the parked cars that seemed older now in the harsh light. I put the car in reverse, my eyes flicking to the windows one last time. They were still watching me. Every single one of them. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I threw the car into drive and sped off, the diner's glow fading behind me until the night swallowed it completely. I didn't sleep much after that. I found another road that eventually connected me back to the main highway, and I kept driving until dawn. Even then, my mind couldn't shake the image of those faces pressed in silence behind the glass. It felt less like a memory, and more like a weight pressing on my chest. When the sun finally rose, I realized I was close to where I had been the night before. Part of me wanted to keep driving and never think about that diner again, but another part of me needed to see it in daylight. Needed to prove to myself that maybe I had just been tired, that my mind had been playing tricks. So I turned down the same road. The trees looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more ordinary, though the air still carried a kind of stillness that put me on edge. I followed the winding road until I came around the curve where the diner had stood glowing the night before. But there was nothing like what I had seen. The neon lights were gone. The chrome exterior was dull and streaked with rust. Boards were nailed across the windows, some of them cracked and splintered, as if they'd been up there for years. The front door was chained shut, the sign above it hanging at a crooked angle, its letters so faded they were barely readable. Weeds pushed up through the gravel lot, and the cars I had seen the night before weren't there. Just empty ground, littered with broken bottles and scraps of old trash that had blown in with the wind. I parked on the side of the road and got out, my heart hammering in my chest. I walked up to the building, the crunch of weeds and gravel beneath my shoes loud in the silence. The boards across the windows were thick with dust, and when I pressed my hand against the glass at the corner where a crack let the light through, all I saw inside was emptiness. No tables, no chairs, just a hollow shell. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. I looked around the lot again, searching for any sign of life, any hint that the place had ever been what I saw the night before. But there was nothing. The whole diner looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I stood there for a long time, the morning sun creeping higher, the air warming around me, but I couldn't shake the chill running through me. The logical part of my brain tried to piece it together. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. Maybe there was another diner somewhere nearby, and I had confused the locations. Maybe exhaustion had warped my senses, made me see things that weren't really there. I wanted to believe that. I tried to believe it, but deep down I couldn't, because no matter how much I tried to reason it away, I could still see their faces. Every single one of them, staring. I never went back down that road again. In fact, I avoided that whole part of the state whenever I could. People I talked to later told me that diner had been closed for years after a fire gutted the inside. Nobody had eaten there in decades. Yet I know what I saw, and I know they saw me too. I grew up in a small farming town where everyone knew everyone, and news spread faster than the crops in the fields. The place was simple and predictable, a quiet rhythm of tractors rumbling in the distance, dogs barking at night, and families gathering at the diner on weekends. But there was one thing that never quite fit into the routine of that town, and it was the house at the end of Willow Street. The house wasn't abandoned, not in the way you'd picture an old farmhouse with broken windows and weeds swallowing the porch. This one was always maintained, the lawn trimmed, the siding never peeling, the curtains always drawn tight, as if the place had something to hide. At night, you could see the faint glow of lights inside, sometimes upstairs, sometimes downstairs, but never more than 1 or 2 rooms at a time. It wasn't the kind of house you walked past slowly. Even as a kid, I'd find myself holding my breath when riding my bike by it, speeding up like the longer I lingered, the more dangerous it became. Nobody ever admitted to seeing who lived there. Some claimed it was owned by a man who came into town once every few months to buy supplies at the hardware store. Others thought maybe it was a caretaker of some kind, looking after it for relatives who lived far away. But those were guesses, because in a town where you knew everyone's truck by the sound of its muffler, nobody knew what car belonged to that house. The driveway was always empty, and yet the house was alive at night. Curtains shut, shadows shifting faintly behind them, and that soft orange glow spilling into the dark. One evening, long after I was old enough to know better, but still curious enough to do something stupid, I was walking home with a friend of mine after hanging around town. The air was cooling fast, the sky heavy with that deep purple that comes just before night. We weren't talking much, just listening to the sound of gravel crunching under our shoes, when we came around the corner onto Willow Street. The house stood there the same as always, plain but somehow heavier than the others, like it carried a weight none of the other homes did. And that's when we both heard it. Faint music, carried through the still evening air. It wasn't the crackling hum of a modern stereo or the muffled thump of a television. This was older, slower, a soft swing tune that sounded like it belonged on a scratched record from the 1940s. It was the kind of music you might hear in an old film, the kind your grandparents might have danced to in their youth. It was so faint we thought at first it was coming from somewhere else, maybe a car radio. But there were no cars parked nearby, no people out on porches. The music was seeping from the house itself. We stopped without meaning to, glancing at each other before both of us turned our eyes back to the house. And then it happened. The front door creaked open, not wide, not like someone was inviting us in, but just a few inches, enough that the music spilled out clearer, drifting into the empty street. The sound seemed sharper, more alive, as though the air itself carried the tune down the road. No one came out. No voice called to us. No shape appeared in the gap of the doorway. The house just stood there with its mouth open, the song echoing into the dusk. My chest tightened, every hair on my body standing on end. I couldn't tear my eyes from the dark slit of the doorway, waiting for movement, for something, for someone. But the silence around the music was crushing. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped, and the street was empty except for us and that house with its strange invitation. We didn't stick around. We walked faster at first, then broke into a run once we'd passed the edge of the block. By the time we reached the end of the street, my lungs burned, and my friend's face was pale and tense, but neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The air between us was filled with the same thought. We'd seen something we weren't supposed to. The next morning, I walked past Willow Street again, slower this time, careful, trying to see if anything had changed. The curtains were drawn tight like they always were, the lawn neat, the front door shut firm. It was as if the night before had never happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. For days after, my mind circled back to that door. Why had it opened? Why was there music at all? The easy answer would have been that someone lived there, someone who liked old records and maybe stepped away for a moment and forgot to shut the door tight. But if that were true, why hadn't we ever seen them? Why had no one in town ever caught a glimpse of who came and went? I started noticing things I hadn't before. I'd see the faint flicker of light behind the curtains later at night, sometimes well past midnight. I'd be walking home from somewhere and notice how the upstairs window seemed to glow faintly, like someone was pacing with a lamp. Once, I thought I caught the briefest silhouette against the fabric of the curtains, a tall shape that shifted and then was gone before I could decide if I'd really seen it. My friend wanted nothing to do with it. He brushed it off, told me to forget about it, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. It was like an itch in my head, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it got. I started walking by the house more often, sometimes circling Willow Street just to see if anything was different. Most of the time, it wasn't. The house stayed locked, tight, silent during the day, faintly alive at night. The only thing that ever changed was me. The more I thought about it, the more the house seemed to loom in my mind, filling space it didn't deserve. I'd find myself replaying that sound of the door creaking, the way the music floated out into the empty street. I'd wake up at night with the song stuck in my head, as if I'd been hearing it in my sleep. Weeks later, I decided I had to see more. Not to go inside, not to do anything reckless. Just to get closer, to prove to myself that it was just a normal house. One night, I walked there alone. The streets were quiet, the town tucked away in sleep. When I reached Willow Street, I stopped at the corner, staring at the house. Light glowed faintly in one window upstairs. The curtains were pulled, as always. No sound reached me at first. I stood there long enough that my nerves started to calm, and I almost laughed at myself for being so worked up. And then the music started again. Soft, scratchy, carried on the air just like before. My stomach dropped, but I made myself walk closer. My shoes crunched on the gravel, every sound too loud in the stillness. I stopped at the sidewalk in front of the house, the music clearer now, the same kind of swing tune, cheerful but warped slightly by age and distance. The door stayed shut this time. I stood there until my chest tightened with the sense that I was being watched, that behind those curtains, someone was standing, still and silent, waiting for me to move. I couldn't take it anymore. I left, fast, heart pounding all the way home. I never went back at night after that. But from then on, the house changed for me. It was no longer just the place everyone avoided. It was a weight I carried, a secret I kept. Whenever I passed it, I felt the memory of that music tugging at me, reminding me of the night the door had opened. And I knew without saying it that the house would stay the same. Curtains drawn, lights flickering at odd hours, music drifting through the night now and then, sealed tight, untouchable, as if daring anyone to really find out who or what was inside. And in that tiny town, where everything else was familiar and safe, the house remained the one place that never gave answers, only questions. I realized, eventually, that was the worst part. Not knowing. Not ghosts, not monsters, not some wild story. Just the silence, the secrets, and the fact that no one would ever really tell us why the door had opened that night. So the house stayed, and I avoided it like everyone else, though I could never quite forget the sound of that music drifting into the empty street, or the dark space behind that door waiting for something I never wanted to see. I had been on the road for almost 2 hours by the time I came to that long, lonely stretch outside the small town. The town itself had only been a quick blur of old storefronts and a gas station with a flickering sign. The kind of place where you could tell most people had either moved on or were hanging on because they had nowhere else to go. By the time I left it behind me, the night had settled in thick and heavy, the kind of darkness that makes the headlights of your car feel too small for the road ahead. The road cut straight through flat fields and scattered trees. No lights, no houses, nothing but the occasional mailbox that looked like it had been forgotten decades ago. I remember feeling a kind of quiet relief at the emptiness at first, like I could just push through the miles without distraction, just me and the hum of the engine. The air smelled faintly of cut grass when I cracked the window, and the only sounds besides the tires on asphalt were crickets and the faint buzz of power lines that stretched off into the distance. It was peaceful in a way, but also unsettling, because the further I went, the more it felt like I was driving deeper into nothing. I hadn't seen another car for miles. No headlights behind me, no taillights ahead, just my own little bubble of light moving forward in an ocean of black. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Something at the side of the road caught in the beams of my headlights, not moving, just standing there. The figure came into focus as I got closer, and I realized it was a woman. She stood by the shoulder, her thumb stuck out stiffly like she was asking for a ride. Her posture was strange though, too straight, too rigid, like she had planted herself there and hadn't moved in a long time. Her head was tilted slightly down but turned toward the road, and the pale of her face caught just enough of the light that I knew for sure it wasn't just some scarecrow or trick of the eyes. Something about the way she looked made me slow down almost without thinking. She was wearing clothes that didn't make sense for the time. A faded dress that hung loose and low, the hem brushing her ankles. It wasn't modern, not even close. It looked like something from decades back, the kind of fabric and cut you might see in old photographs tucked away in boxes in someone's attic. She had no bag, no jacket, no sign of anything that explained why she was standing out there in the middle of nowhere. I pulled the car to the shoulder and eased to a stop a few feet ahead of her. The gravel crunched under my tires, and for a moment, I just sat there, watching her in the rearview mirror. She didn't move. Her arm hung back down by her side now, thumb gone, but she hadn't stepped forward. I unlocked the door automatically, my hand hovering near the handle to crack it open, but something about her stillness made me roll down the window instead. The night air rushed in, cooler than I expected, carrying with it the sharp scent of dirt and dry grass. I leaned slightly toward the window, squinting at her in the dim wash of my taillights. Her face was pale, but not in an unhealthy way, more like the washed-out color of old photographs. She stared right at me, her eyes locked on mine. No words came from her, no movement, not even a blink that I could see. Just a stare that lasted long enough to make my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to say something, but the sound died before I could even form the words. The silence pressed in harder than before, and then, just like that, she was gone. It wasn't like she turned away or walked into the field. There was no sound of footsteps in the gravel, no rustle of grass, no shadow moving off into the dark. 1 second she was there, her eyes fixed on me, and the next the space was empty. My headlights still stretched down the road. The taillights still glowed behind me. The spot where she had stood was nothing but dirt and weeds. My door was still unlocked. I felt it immediately, a tight grip in my chest that spread down into my arms and stomach. My hand shot to the lock button, pressing it down until I heard the click. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel as I shifted back into drive. I didn't look back in the mirror. I didn't look to the side. I just stared at the road ahead and pushed the gas down harder than I needed to. The road stretched on, each mile feeling longer than the last. My hands stayed tight on the wheel, the veins in my wrists standing out. Every sound outside felt sharper now. The chirp of crickets seemed too loud. The rustle of leaves against each other made me think of movement, like someone walking just beyond the reach of the lights. Even the engine's hum felt wrong, like it was straining against something unseen. I kept thinking about the way she looked. Her clothes, her face, the stare that felt heavier the longer I remembered it. It wasn't just strange. It was out of place, like she belonged to another time entirely. The emptiness of the road made it worse. There was nowhere she could have gone. The fields on either side stretched open and flat for hundreds of yards, no cover, no houses. I should have seen her walking, running, anything. But there had been nothing. The farther I drove, the more I kept glancing at the passenger seat, the back seat, the mirrors. My brain played tricks on me, filling the corner of my vision with the suggestion of movement. I imagined turning my head and seeing her sitting silently beside me, hands folded in her lap, still staring. The thought made the skin on my arms prickle. I gripped the wheel tighter, the muscles in my forearms aching. I tried to push the thoughts down, to focus only on the road, but the emptiness had a weight of its own. It felt like I was being pulled further and further from safety with every mile. When the town lights finally appeared in the distance, faint and blurry, I felt my shoulders sag with relief. The sight of gas station signs, the glow of street lamps, even a single car parked along the curb, it all felt like a lifeline. When I pulled into the first lit gas station I found, I parked under the fluorescent canopy and just sat there for a while, engine off, the silence now broken by the hum of the lights above and the distant sound of traffic on the main road beyond town. My hands shook slightly as I let go of the wheel, the deep grooves of tension still in my palms. I looked around the car, checking every seat, every shadow, just to make sure I was alone. There was no one, just me and the empty car. I don't know what I saw on that stretch of road, and maybe I never will. All I know is that she was there, as real as anything I've ever seen, and then she was gone. No sound, no trace, nothing but the memory of her eyes staring straight through me. I drove the rest of the way gripping the wheel so tight my hands ached, and even now, I can still feel the pressure in my chest when I think about it. Since that night, I can't drive through an empty stretch of road without glancing at the shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there again, waiting. And if I ever do, I don't think I'll stop. I still remember the first time my uncle ever told me about those nights at the mill. He didn't speak about them like a story he wanted to entertain me with. He spoke about them like someone trying to unload a weight he'd been carrying for years. I could see it in the way he paused between sentences, the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned certain details. He had worked in that mill since he was a teenager, pulling long shifts, sometimes 14 hours straight. The mill was old, built back when the town was still booming with industry. By the time my uncle worked there, most of the buildings around it had gone silent. The streets would be empty when he clocked out, not a soul in sight, just the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional train rattling in the distance. Every night, he'd take the same route home, walking down the cracked sidewalk that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. There weren't many streetlights on that stretch, and the ones that still worked cast more shadows than they cleared. He told me the nights smelled of hot iron and old oil from the mill, with a faint sourness that clung to his clothes. His boots would drag a little at first until his legs adjusted to the walk, and he said he always noticed the sound of gravel crunching when he stepped near the tracks. That sound became something familiar, almost comforting. But then came the nights when he began noticing the man. It started the same way each time. He'd be leaving the mill late, sometime after midnight, and about halfway home he'd see a figure standing near the tracks. Always in the same spot, just a little beyond where the sidewalk cracked and dipped. At first, he thought it was someone from town heading home too. But as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't just a passerby. The man was always facing the same way, looking down the long stretch of track that disappeared into the trees. One hand stayed in his pocket, and the other held a cigarette between his fingers. The cherry never glowed, though. My uncle thought maybe he'd already smoked it down to the filter. But night after night, the man was there again, same posture, same cigarette untouched. For weeks my uncle tried to ignore it. He had a habit of keeping his eyes forward when walking home, focusing on the path ahead, the shape of his own shadow in the lamplight. But he couldn't stop himself from glancing over each time, and sure enough, the man was there. It became something he expected, like the way he expected to hear the rumble of a train or the whistle blowing faintly from far away. And yet, every time he saw him, his stomach tightened. There was something unnatural about the repetition of it. Same time, same place, same unlit cigarette. One night, after too many hours of work, my uncle let his curiosity get the better of him. He slowed his pace as he drew near. He figured maybe the man was down on his luck, maybe he was just lonely, maybe he needed a light. So he stepped closer, but as he did, something about the figure froze him in place. He noticed that the man never looked up, never shifted his weight, never moved at all except for the faint sway of his body, like someone standing too long on their feet. And the cigarette, it wasn't burnt, not even a little. The paper was white, clean, unlit, as if it had just been taken from a pack. My uncle said the man's face looked blank, not lifeless, but hollow, like someone staring so hard down the tracks they forgot the world around them even existed. He didn't say a word. He just kept walking, his pace quickening until the figure disappeared behind him. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling followed him all the way home, that crawling awareness that he had stood just a few feet away from someone who wasn't really there with him, even though they were flesh and bone. The next week, he saw him again. Same place, same cigarette, same pose. By then, my uncle stopped trying to make sense of it. He didn't go closer anymore. He just kept his head down and passed by. But every time, he couldn't help but glance once, and every time he got that same sick feeling in his stomach. He said it wasn't fear of violence. The man didn't look threatening. It was fear of the unnatural rhythm of it, fear of seeing something repeat itself night after night without reason. As time went on, my uncle started to pay more attention to little details. He noticed the man's clothes never changed. Same jacket, same dark pants, same scuffed shoes that caught the faint light when he stepped close enough. He noticed the way the cigarette stayed pinched between the same two fingers, angled slightly upward, like it was waiting for a flame that never came. And he noticed the way the man's eyes stayed locked on the tracks, as if he was waiting for something far down that stretch, something only he knew was coming. One night, my uncle left the mill a little later than usual. The machines had broken down, and he stayed back to help fix them. When he finally stepped out, the air felt heavier than normal, the kind of damp thickness that made sound carry differently. He walked the same route, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, the faint glow of the one working streetlight buzzing overhead. He knew before he even turned the corner that the man would be there. Sure enough, as he reached the bend, he saw the figure by the tracks, unmoving. This time, though, there was no train whistle in the distance, no sound at all except the faint hum of insects. As he got closer, he felt his chest tighten. The man looked the same, cigarette between his fingers, eyes on the tracks. My uncle said for a moment he thought about stopping again, thought about demanding to know what he was doing there. But something deep inside him told him to keep moving. He walked past, and as he did, he felt the man's presence so strongly it was like walking through a current of air. He didn't hear a word, didn't see him move, but he swore he felt the man's focus shift just slightly, like those eyes followed him for a fraction of a second before returning to the tracks. After that night, he started taking a longer route home, even though it added nearly half an hour to his walk. He said he couldn't keep passing by that spot anymore, couldn't keep brushing shoulders with something that didn't change. Sometimes he'd glance across the empty lots and catch sight of the railroad tracks in the distance. And even from far away, he swore he could see a faint shape standing right where it always stood, cigarette still waiting. Months later, he heard the story. He was sitting at the diner one morning, drinking coffee before his shift, when two older men at the counter started talking. They were mentioning names he didn't recognize at first, people who had lived in town decades earlier. Then one of them said something about a guy who used to walk down to the tracks every night, always waiting for the train. The man had worked at the same mill, long before my uncle's time. One night, he was supposed to meet someone who never showed. He waited there for hours, cigarette in hand, but never lit it because he didn't have matches. Eventually, he left, but a few nights later he came back. It became a routine, always standing at the tracks, cigarette ready, waiting. Then one night, he never came home. They found him days later farther down the tracks, hit by a train. Some said it was an accident, some said it wasn't. My uncle never told me what he believed. He just said that after hearing that story, he never went near that stretch of tracks again, not even in daylight. He never found out if the man he saw was someone real, someone stuck in their own habit, or if it was just a trick his mind played on him after too many long nights at the mill. But he swore that when he passed by, he could feel the weight of someone standing there, heavy and solid, as real as the gravel under his boots. When he finished telling me all of this, he leaned back and went quiet for a long time. He didn't smile or laugh or shrug it off like some old memory. He just stared at the table and said that some things in life stick with you, not because you understand them, but because you never can. And that was the last time he ever spoke about the man by the tracks. I was driving through a stretch of road that cut through a small town, the kind of place where you could blink and miss it if you weren't paying attention. The streets were empty, the buildings dark, and the only light came from the soft orange glow of the street lamps that hummed against the quiet night. I had been on the road for hours already, worn down from the kind of endless drive that made the lines on the pavement blur together. My eyes felt heavy, my shoulders stiff from gripping the wheel too tightly, and all I could think about was how badly I needed gas before I found myself stranded out here with no help for miles. When I finally spotted the faded sign of a gas station at the edge of town, it felt almost like a relief I didn't deserve. The place looked half abandoned, its peeling paint and crooked sign lit only by a single buzzing floodlight that barely cut through the dark. The canopy over the pumps leaned slightly, as if time and weather had beaten it down over the years. The lot itself was nearly empty except for one truck, a rusty old pickup parked off to the side. At first, I didn't think much about it. Trucks like that weren't uncommon in small towns. But as I pulled up to the pump, I felt something that made me uneasy before I even turned off the engine. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel natural, the kind where you felt watched even before you knew you were. I got out of my car, the cold night air biting against my skin as I shoved my hands in my jacket pockets. The pump looked old but functional, and I slid my card through with shaky fingers. The moment the gas started flowing, I glanced around, just out of habit. That's when I saw him. The man inside the truck was staring straight at me. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but I could see enough. He wasn't glancing, he wasn't idly watching. He was fixed on me, completely still, like a hunting animal that had already locked onto its target. His eyes never shifted, never blinked, just pinned me in place. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just some local sitting in his truck, bored and passing the time. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became to ignore. His face never moved. His posture never changed. The gas pump clicked steadily, the only sound in the silence, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, checking if he had gotten out. When the tank was full, I pulled the nozzle out and slid it back into place. My hands shook a little, though I tried to act normal. I headed inside to pay, pushing the glass door open, and the weak chime of a bell broke the silence. The inside of the station was no better than the outside. The shelves were half empty, the floor grimy, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was almost louder than the old refrigerator at the back. A man stood behind the counter, older, his face tired and lined, his eyes a little too aware. He looked at me in a way that told me he knew more than he wanted to share. I set some cash on the counter, ready to get out as fast as possible, and that's when he leaned slightly closer. His voice was low, almost cautious, like he didn't want anyone else to hear, even though the station was empty. He told me not to stick around too long. Then he added something that made my stomach drop. He said that the man in the truck waits here every night. I froze for a moment, the words sticking in my mind heavier than I expected. My instinct told me to look back, but my body fought against it, not wanting to confirm what I already feared. Still, curiosity won, and I turned my head just enough to see through the window. The truck door was open now, and the man was stepping out. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He was walking toward my car. I didn't wait. My heart hammered in my chest as I pushed the door open and made for my car, my steps quick but uneven. The night air felt heavier now, and every sound, the crunch of my shoes on gravel, the faint creak of the pump, seemed magnified in the silence. I fumbled with the handle, yanked the door open, and slid inside, locking it the second I was in. By the time I started the engine, he was closer. I didn't look directly at him, but I could see enough from the corner of my eye. His face was pale under the floodlight, his expression unreadable, and his eyes were still locked on me. He wasn't rushing. He didn't have to. He just kept moving with that same steady pace, closing the distance like it didn't matter how long it took. I shifted into drive, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel, and pulled away faster than I meant to. Gravel scattered behind me as my tires caught the edge of the lot, and I forced myself not to glance in the mirror until I hit the road. When I finally looked, I saw his headlights flare on. He was following me. The road out of town was empty, a long stretch of cracked pavement cutting into the dark, and those headlights stuck to me like they were tied by a rope. No matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, they stayed right there, always the same distance behind me. Minutes stretched into miles, and my chest grew tighter with every passing second. I could feel the sweat on my palms, my foot pressing harder on the gas, but the road didn't give me anywhere to run. Every turn led to another empty stretch, another shadowed line of trees or broken fence. I kept watching the mirror, hoping to see him turn off, hoping to convince myself I was imagining it. But he never wavered. His lights burned into me, a reminder that he was still there, still coming. It went on like that for what felt like forever. My body was wound so tight I thought I'd break apart, my knuckles white against the wheel, my breathing ragged. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge, knowing I couldn't afford to burn through what I'd just filled. I couldn't keep outrunning him forever. Then, finally, after what must have been 10 miles or more, his headlights swerved. At first, I thought it was a trick, another move to unsettle me. But the beam shifted, the glow fading as he slowed, then turned down a side road that disappeared into the dark. Just like that, he was gone. I didn't ease up right away. I kept driving, faster than I should, my heart still pounding as though he were right behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the next town over, where lights filled the streets and people still moved between late-night diners and 24-hour stores. I pulled into a well-lit parking lot, put the car in park, and sat there for a long time with my hands still gripping the wheel. My chest rose and fell in shaky bursts, and it was only then, surrounded by the safety of other people, that I let myself breathe again. The man hadn't caught me. He hadn't done anything except follow, but that was enough. Enough to tell me that whatever game he was playing wasn't meant to end well for me if I had stayed. To this day, I don't know why he stopped, why he turned off when he did, or what he was waiting for back at that station. But I know this much. If I ever see a truck like his again, parked in the shadows of a lonely station, I won't stop. I'll keep driving, because I don't think he was just watching me. I think he was waiting for someone who didn't leave in time. I still remember the first time my wife told me about the accident. It was years after we were married, when we were driving back through the hills of West Virginia to visit her parents. The road wound up and around the mountains, and she grew quiet, staring out the window as the trees and shadows slipped by. At first, I thought she was just lost in thought, maybe a little homesick, but then she asked me to slow down. We were coming up on a sharp curve, the kind that makes your stomach tighten even in broad daylight. She pointed off toward the drop-off where the tree line opened to a steep descent, and her voice lowered as she explained that this was where 3 of her friends had died. She had never told me the full story before that moment. She gave me the bare facts first, how they were all drunk after prom, how they lost control and slammed into a tree, how the car tumbled down the slope and landed in the shallow part of the river. But then she told me the detail that still haunts her more than anything. When the wreckage was finally pulled out, half buried in the river silt, investigators found bloody handprints on the inside of the rear window. One of the girls had survived the impact, at least for a little while. The rear of the car had remained above the water, but she was trapped in the back seat, badly hurt, clawing at the glass until her strength gave out. My wife was supposed to be with them that night. She should have been in that car. The thought of it hit me harder than I could admit to her at the time. I glanced over at her, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard, and tried to imagine what it would have been like if she had been there. It wasn't hard. Every detail she gave me painted it clearer, like my own memory filling in the blanks. I could see that prom night in my mind, as if I had been standing in the gymnasium myself. The smell of perfume and floor wax, the muffled bass of music rattling the walls, the tired teachers standing along the edges pretending to keep order. My wife had no date that night, because I was working out of state, saving money for our future. She had planned to leave early anyway, but she was supposed to ride with those girls. At the last moment, she got a call from work. Her boss needed someone to cover, and she agreed. She told me she didn't even think much about it at the time. She left the prom, changed clothes, clocked in, and spent the night behind a counter under buzzing fluorescent lights while her friends, dressed in gowns and tuxes, laughed and staggered into that car. She didn't know until the next morning what had happened. She woke up groggy after her shift, still wearing her uniform, and her phone lit up with messages. That was how she found out. 3 of her closest friends were gone, and she had missed it by nothing more than a coincidence. I've gone back to that story in my head more times than I can count. Every time I do, it grows heavier, more real. I picture the car itself, a mid-sized sedan, old enough that the seat belts probably didn't always work right. The paint dulled, a dent already in the fender from some earlier accident. They must have crammed into it still full of the night's excitement, carrying the buzz of alcohol and freedom, music spilling from the speakers as they sped down that winding mountain road. The air would have been damp and cool, the windows fogging from breath, the road slick in places where the night mist gathered. I imagine the driver, a boy who thought he was in control, his tie loosened, his hand gripping the wheel too tight, his reflexes dulled by liquor. The others in the back, laughing, shouting, tired but unwilling to let the night end. Then the curve coming too fast. The sudden sickening realization that they weren't going to make it. The screech of tires, the snap of tree limbs, the crunch of metal folding in on itself. The plunge down into the dark, the world turning end over end until it ended with a slam, and the cold rush of water pressing against the car. The thing that stays with me most isn't the crash itself, but what happened after. That girl in the back seat, still alive. Hurt badly, disoriented, maybe pinned at first before she fought her way free enough to move. She saw the others weren't moving, or maybe she couldn't even reach them. She must have realized the front of the car was submerged, water filling in fast. But the rear end had landed tilted up, sticking out above the surface. She must have seen the faint glow of the moonlight through the back glass, the air still good enough to breathe. She had a chance. So she tried. She beat her hands bloody on the glass. She left the prints they later found, smeared against the inside of the window. Each mark a desperate attempt to break through, to find air, to claw her way back into the world. She must have kept going even as her body failed her, even as pain and exhaustion overtook her. And then she stopped. Whether it was from her injuries or from the water rising too fast, no one could ever say. All they had were the marks she left behind, proof that she was alive long enough to try. When my wife tells this story, her voice always grows tight at that part. I can see it on her face, the understanding that she might have been sitting next to that girl. She might have been the one leaving handprints on the glass, fighting in vain while the night swallowed the car. I think about it too. I think about how narrow the line is between life and death, how a single phone call kept her out of that car. I think about how different my life would have been if she had been there. There would have been no wedding, no home we built together, no late-night drives through these same winding roads with her sitting beside me. It all depended on something as small as a manager needing someone to cover a shift. That stretch of road hasn't changed much since then. The guardrails are still bent in places from accidents over the years. The trees stand tall and silent, their roots holding to the steep earth, their branches reaching out over the blacktop. And the river still runs below, shallow in spots but strong enough to carry debris downstream. Every time we drive past, I can't help but glance down and imagine the car resting there, half buried in mud, unseen except for the rescuers who pulled it free. Sometimes I think about the parents of those kids, how they must have felt when the police came to the door in the early hours of the morning. The knock that shatters everything. The slow realization that the prom pictures they had taken just hours before would be the last photos of their children alive. I think about the funerals, the closed caskets, the flowers that withered in churchyards. My wife was at those funerals. She stood among the mourners, watching the coffins lowered, knowing she should have been inside one of them. Survivor's guilt is a heavy thing. She doesn't talk about it often, but I can see it in her eyes when she tells the story. It shaped her in ways she doesn't always admit. She became more cautious, more aware of the weight of small choices. She never drinks when she knows she has to drive. She never lets me speed on those roads. And sometimes, late at night, I'll catch her staring into the dark as if she's still trying to make sense of it all, as if part of her is still standing at the edge of that river, looking down at the wreckage and wondering why she wasn't inside it. The story ends with silence. No twist, no comfort. Just the knowledge that 3 young lives ended violently in the dark, and one girl fought desperately against glass and steel before giving up her last breath. My wife lived because of a coincidence, a shift at work, a decision made in passing, and that has haunted her ever since. When I think of it now, I don't just see her friends in that car. I see her. I see the way her life could have ended that night, and I realize how fragile everything really is. The bloody handprints in that window are long gone, washed away when the car was hauled out, but in a way, they're still here. They're in every cautious glance my wife gives when we drive through the mountains, in every quiet pause when she remembers that night. They're proof of how close death came to her, and how easily it could have taken her away from me before our life together even began. And every time we passed that stretch of road, I gripped the wheel a little tighter and thanked whatever chance spared her, because it wasn't just her life saved that night. It was mine too, though in a different way. Without her, none of what I know as my world would exist. All because of a shift at work, and the bloody handprints left behind in the wreck of a car at the bottom of a West Virginia river. I still remember that night like it's carved into my mind. Every second of it burned into me. The smell of the air, the way the lights looked, even the faint hum of the neon signs down the strip. It was about 2 a.m, a dead, quiet hour in my little town. The kind of silence where you can hear a car long before you see it. My town wasn't big, only about 3 square miles from edge to edge, so when something happened, it echoed everywhere. People biked home from the bar because you could get anywhere in 10 minutes on a bike. It was one of those nights where you expected to see a few stragglers wobbling on their bikes, maybe a couple of people walking in small groups, laughing too loud. That was normal. What wasn't normal was what I stumbled into. I had been driving back from a friend's place, just cutting through town like I always did. The main drag stretched straight through the heart of everything, lined with little convenience stores, a couple of diners that stayed open late, and the glow of the bar where everyone ended up no matter what. I was maybe 5 minutes out when I saw the flashing lights, except there weren't any sirens, just one cruiser angled weird on the side of the road. The night was still, and the sudden scene in the middle of that silence hit me harder than I expected. It didn't feel right even before I pulled closer. When I slowed down, the first thing I noticed wasn't the cop or the cruiser. It was the shape lying on the road. A man. He wasn't moving. His body looked bent in a way that made me sick to my stomach. A bike was twisted halfway into the curb, the wheel bent so far it didn't even look like a bike anymore. A shoe was lying on the opposite side of the street, and his hat was a good 20 feet away, like they'd been blown off by some violent force. The way everything was scattered made me stop cold. It wasn't a small accident. This guy had been hit hard. I parked down the street and walked closer, trying to piece together what I was seeing. The cop was crouched over the man, his hands pressing down on him, maybe checking for a pulse, maybe trying to keep him still. His face looked tense, but not panicked, more like he was trying too hard to look calm. The cruiser was idling, its headlights still cutting through the scene. No skid marks on the pavement. That was the first thing that jumped out at me. If you hit someone going that fast, you'd slam on the brakes. But the road looked clean, like the car never slowed down. There weren't many people around, just a handful of folks who must have been leaving the bar when it happened. They stood off to the side, whispering, pointing, not sure what to do. One guy looked pale, like he'd seen the whole thing unfold. Another girl kept pacing, hugging herself, looking back toward the bar as if deciding whether to stay or slip away. I could feel the unease in the air. People didn't want to be there. They didn't want to get dragged into it. And slowly, they started to disperse, walking back toward the glow of the bar, leaving just me, the cop, and the man on the ground. I stayed where I was for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. My eyes kept tracing the distance between the hat, the shoe, the bike, and the body. It didn't line up in a way that made sense for a normal hit. It spoke of speed, of force, of a body being flung through the air before crashing down. The main drag had a speed limit of 35, everyone knew that. But the way this looked, this wasn't 35. This was closer to 60, maybe more. And the fact that the cruiser lights were on, but no siren had been sounded earlier, made my stomach twist. This wasn't an accident in the ordinary sense. This was something else. I glanced around, spotted the corner convenience store across the street. Old place, the kind that never closed, lit up by buzzing fluorescent lights. An idea hit me, sharp and sudden. Evidence. This wasn't right, and if someone didn't take note of it, it'd vanish. I crossed the street fast, went straight inside, grabbed one of those disposable cameras hanging near the register. Paid in cash, shoved the change into my pocket, and headed right back out. My hands were shaking, but I lifted the camera and started clicking, photo after photo. The body, the bike, the scattered hat and shoe, the cruiser's position, the road with no skid marks. Every angle I could think of. I knew I had maybe one chance before someone noticed. I wasn't even 10 shots in when I felt a shadow moving close. The cop was on me. I didn't hear him walk up, but suddenly he was right there, his face tight, his voice low, demanding to know what I was doing. I didn't answer. I just kept my hand steady, trying to take one more shot before he reached out. Then his hand clamped down on mine, hard, and he yanked the camera from me. My chest went hot with anger and fear all at once. He looked me dead in the eye, the kind of look that told me this wasn't just about me breaking some made-up rule. This was about control. This was about making sure nothing I saw left with me. He tucked the camera into his jacket, turned back like nothing had happened. My mouth went dry. It wasn't just the crash that was wrong now, it was everything after. The way he acted, the way he made sure there'd be no photos, no record of how bad it looked. I stood frozen watching him. The ambulance siren finally cut through the night, wailing louder as it got closer. Within minutes, paramedics were swarming the man, strapping him down, rushing him onto a stretcher. I caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, bloodied, lifeless except for the faint twitch of his chest when he breathed shallowly. He didn't look like he'd make it through the night. I stayed back, hidden in the crowd that had reformed at the edges as the ambulance pulled away. The cop was talking to another officer now, one that had just shown up, his words sharp, clipped, rehearsed almost. They weren't writing anything down. They weren't measuring distances, weren't taking pictures, weren't noting the lack of skid marks. They just stood there, nodding, listening, moving through the steps like a checklist without any real effort. I knew right then it was going to be buried. The cop who hit him would walk away clean, and the man on the bike, if he even survived, would be painted as careless, drunk, maybe reckless. I'd seen it before in small ways. But this was different. This was life or death, and they were covering it up in plain sight. The ambulance roared off into the distance, and the crowd thinned again. I lingered longer, staring at the empty stretch of road, at the marks in the dirt where the bike had been dragged, at the lone shoe still lying on the curb. The silence that followed was heavier than before. When I finally got back in my car and drove home, I felt like I was leaving a crime scene that no one else would ever acknowledge. My mind replayed the way his body had been thrown, the distance of the hat and shoe, the way the cop had ripped the camera from me without hesitation. Those weren't details I could forget. They were burned into me. Weeks passed, and the story that came out in the local paper was thin. A cyclist struck late at night, condition serious. The report said he had failed to yield. No mention of the cop's speed, no mention of skid marks, no mention of how far the man had been thrown. Nothing about the confiscated camera. Just a short piece, tucked between the weather and an ad for a car dealership. People read it, maybe shook their heads, maybe forgot about it 5 minutes later. But I knew better. I had seen it up close. The guy survived, but barely. He was in critical care for 8 months, hooked up to machines, learning to breathe again, learning to move again. 8 months of hell because a cop couldn't slow down on an empty street. I thought about that night more than I wanted to. The silence of the street, the way the crowd had melted away, the way my hands had shaken while I tried to click the shutter. I thought about how quickly the cop had reacted, like he'd done it before, like confiscating proof was just another part of the job. I thought about how fragile the truth was in a town that small, how easily it could be bent or erased with the right words from the right people. And I thought about the man who had been hit, about how he'd trusted the rules of the road, how he'd done everything right, only to be broken because someone else didn't care. Even now, when I drive past that stretch of road late at night, I slow down without meaning to. I look at the spot where his shoe landed, where the bike crumpled, where his body lay bent on the pavement. The neon lights from the bar still glow, the convenience store still hums, and the silence still feels too heavy. Nothing's written there, no marker, no sign, no reminder. But I carry it. That night never really left me. It stays with me, a warning and a weight, a reminder that not everything we're told is the truth, and not everyone who wears a badge is there to protect us. Some nights, when the streets are empty and I catch the faint echo of tires on asphalt, I feel the same chill I felt that night. The kind that tells you the world isn't as safe as you once believed. I lived in that small town for a couple of years, and for the most part, it was the kind of place where nothing much happened. About 1,800 people, maybe a little less depending on the season. You knew the same faces at the gas station, the grocery store, the post office. The same pickup trucks parked outside the diner every morning. When I first moved there, I thought it was almost too quiet. You'd walk down the street at night and hear your own footsteps echoing against the brick storefronts. Sometimes, if the wind carried right, you could hear dogs barking clear across town. It was that kind of place, small, slow, predictable. But that spring, everything changed. I still remember the day like it was carved into me. I was home, sitting in my living room. The windows cracked open because the weather had finally shifted from winter's bite to something softer. The sound of birds was starting to creep back in after months of silence, and people were just beginning to spend more time outside. Kids were riding bikes, people were mowing lawns again. It felt like life was waking up. Then the sirens came. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sirens were rare, but they happened. Car accidents on the highway, an older resident needing an ambulance. But the sound grew louder, sharper, cutting through the air. I walked outside to my porch, and that's when I noticed neighbors stepping out of their houses too. People stood in driveways, looking down the streets like they were trying to figure out where it was headed. Sirens in a small town didn't just pass unnoticed. Everyone paid attention. A few minutes later, the town felt different. The usual easy rhythm was broken. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was wrong. The kind of wrong you can feel in your chest before you even know the details. Word traveled fast in a town like ours, sometimes faster than the actual facts. By the time I went back inside, my phone buzzed with a message from a friend. There'd been a shooting. I didn't believe it at first. A shooting? Here? In a place where the most exciting news was when the high school football team made it to state? But the story spread fast, bouncing from one person to another until pieces of it started to form a clearer picture. A kid, still in high school, had chased another student through downtown with a gun. The kid being chased was black, and the one with the gun was white. People already knew the one with the gun had some pretty ugly views, the kind that he didn't exactly hide. Some said he wrote about it online, others said it was in his journal. Whichever it wasn't a secret to people who'd gone to school with him. He chased that kid right into the police station. Right into it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Downtown wasn't more than a 5-minute walk from my house. I'd been down there countless times, to grab a sandwich, to pick up mail, to just take a walk when I felt restless. Now I was hearing that a high school kid had run through that same stretch of sidewalk, desperate to escape, only to have the other kid follow him inside the one place you'd think was safe. And then the gun went off. 2 shots inside the station. From what I later learned, the police didn't hesitate. You don't fire a gun inside their walls and expect them to stand there. But before they could even do much, the kid realized what he had done. Maybe it hit him that there was no going back, that his life had just shifted in an instant. He turned the gun on himself. Only he didn't manage to end it. He shot himself through the chin, missed his head, and survived. That image stayed with me more than I wanted it to. I didn't see it firsthand, but the thought of it wouldn't leave me. The desperation, the chaos, the noise of it all just 3 or 4 blocks away from where I sat that afternoon listening to birds. For days, the whole town buzzed with nothing else. Half of the people swore he'd had some sort of breakdown, that maybe he'd snapped under pressure or stress. They wanted to think it was an accident of the mind, not something darker. But the other half weren't so quick to excuse it. They pointed to the things he'd written, the way he'd talked before, the anger that was brewing long before the gun ever came out. To them, it wasn't a breakdown. It was hate, plain and simple. No matter what side people leaned on, the facts didn't change. He was arrested, he went to trial, and he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. That should have been the end of it, at least on paper. But in a town as small as ours, things don't just disappear when the sentence is read. The shadow of it lingered. Every time I walked downtown after that, I thought about it. I'd pass the diner and imagine the kids sprinting by, heart pounding, gunshots not far behind. I'd glance at the police station and picture the chaos of that moment, the crack of a gun inside those walls, officers reaching for their weapons, the confusion, the panic. And then always the image of that kid on the ground, not dead but not whole anymore either. The quiet town wasn't quiet after that. Even when the sirens faded and the trial was done, there was a tension that never really went away. Parents held their kids a little closer, not just because of what had happened, but because it proved that it could happen here. People started locking their doors earlier, avoiding downtown at night. The sidewalks felt emptier, the conversations hushed. For me, the scariest part wasn't the act itself, though it was horrifying. It was realizing how close it had been. 3 or 4 blocks, that's all. A few minutes walk. If I'd decided to head out that day, maybe to grab lunch or take a stroll, I could have been right there, in the middle of it. That thought sat heavy on me. It made me notice things I hadn't before. The way the town was so small that distance didn't mean much. How quickly something could turn from calm to chaos. I'd always thought of small towns as safe, tucked away from the kind of violence you saw on the news. But that day stripped that illusion away. Safety wasn't about size or location. It was fragile, breakable, something that could shatter in the time it took for 2 gunshots to echo inside a building. When I finally moved away, that memory came with me. The town went back to being quiet on the surface, but for me, it never fully did. I carried the weight of knowing how thin the line was between ordinary life and disaster, how even the quietest streets could hold something dark beneath them. And whenever someone asks me about living in a small town, I think back to that spring day. I don't think about the birds or the clear skies or the easy pace of life. I think about the sirens, the sound of them tearing through the stillness, and how close it all came to my doorstep. I think about how quickly a place can change, how quickly safety can vanish, and how some things never leave you once you've seen how fragile the world really is.